They warned her, never go near the Zyn Cubs. They said they'd rip her apart before she could scream. But when the alien adults fled in fear, she stepped forward alone. And what happened next defied every law, every instinct, every species boundary, because the monsters they feared chose her. But if the cubs accepted a human, what would their own people do to her? She thought the danger was over, but the real threat was just beginning. Before we go any further, ask yourself what would make a predator protect its prey? And more importantly, what would it do to anyone who tried to take her away? She wasn't supposed to survive the crash, and she definitely wasn't supposed to survive them. They told every human to stay off. Zyranthra, Forbidden Planet classified red zone. Not because of the weather, not because of the radiation, but because of what lives there. The Zyn Cubs alien young, known for their speed, their strength, their claws that rip through bone, and their hatred for anything not of their kind. So when the shuttle carrying Dr. Mara Lin went down in the southern wilds, and her life signs were picked, up near a Zyn nesting zone, every command post watching from orbit expected the same thing, a scream. Then silence, but what they saw through the drone feeds was something no one could explain. Something no one could believe because the cubs didn't. Tear her apart, they surrounded her, watched her, and then one of them moved closer, 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 and instead of running, instead of screaming, she reached out her hand. It began with fire, a shudder in the black sky. As the research shuttle broke atmosphere too fast, a cascade of warnings flashed red across. The pilot's display, then the world shook. Mara Lin slammed against the harness. Alarms blaring in her ear, she tried to stabilize, tried to pull up, but the planet grabbed her like a beast with claws. She crashed in the southern hemisphere in the old Zyn nesting zone. Hours passed. She woke to smoke, to heat, to silence. The other crew members were gone, the pilot's seat torn from its bolts, half the hull buried in soft blue dirt. Mara crawled from the wreckage, bleeding, dizzy, but alive. Her suit beacon sent out a signal, one that reached the edge of Zyn territory, and woke something ancient. Orbiting above a station full of human researchers detected her beacon. But no one moved, no rescue team sent down, no dropship launched because of the zone. Because of the Zyn Cubs, everyone knew the stories of what happened to intruders. There were no survivors, so they watched using a recon drone. Tiny, silent, fast, the drone zipped through the trees, the canopy thick with black leaves and red mist. It found her within minutes. Mara sat against a stone, breathing hard, wincing at a cut across her leg. She didn't see them at first, but the drone did. 3 know. For Zyn Cubs' eyes, bright bodies low to the ground, mouths open, no sound. They watched her, waited, moved in from every side. She saw them then, and froze. The drone feed picked up her vitals, heart rate spiking, adrenaline flooding her system. One wrong move, and it would all be over. The cubs came closer, silent, effortless, their bodies sleek claws, curved skin, smooth like obsidian glass. Their steps made no sound. Mara remembered the briefings: don't run, don't challenge, don't look them in the eyes. But she was too tired to run, too hurt, too challenge, and too human to look away. The largest cub stood just 10 feet away, its body tense, shoulders raised, muscles rippling under jet black skin, its eyes locked on hers. It stepped forward. The drone operator flinched. One of the scientists monitoring the feed turned away. No one wanted to watch what came next, but she didn't move. Instead, she slowly raised her hand, palm open, no threat. The cub paused, head tilting, a low growl building in its throat. Still, she held her ground. I'm not here to hurt you, she whispered, but no one heard it, not through the drone. The cub inched forward, sniffed the air, then let out a sound the system couldn't identify. Not aggression, it's not warning, something else, a sound that made the other cubs pause. And then the big one stretched out a claw, slow, deliberate. It reached toward her open hand. The drone shifted slightly, trying to get a better angle in that tiny motion. That quiet hum caught the cub's attention. Its head whipped around, a flash of teeth, and the drone feed turned to static, gone. Back at the orbital station, everyone stared at the dark screen. No signal, no video, no answer. She should be dead, but she wasn't. The ground. Mara blinked at the sudden shift. The cub growled, moved in faster. It didn't strike. Not yet. Circled, sniffing again, as if trying to decide what she was, prey, threat, or something else. Mara didn't dare lower her hand. Her legs screamed in pain, but she stayed still. Another cub approached, smaller, with a broken tooth. It Made the same sound the first one had, a humming trill, almost curious. Mara looked from one to the other. She whispered again, "I'm not your enemy. I'm lost, please. I just want to go home." The cubs circled her like a living storm, their steps soft, their eyes glowing in the dusk. Then the first cub, the leader, stepped even closer. Its claw touched her palm and paused it. Time stopped then. Without warning, it lowered its head and pressed it against her hand. Mara nearly cried, not from fear, but something else, something deeper connection behind them. The other cubs watched, and then one by one, they stepped forward too. By the time the stars rose, Mara was sitting on the forest floor, surrounded, encircled not by monsters but by children, alien children. The children still. She was alive, though. Orbital station finally regained partial feed from a secondary drone. The video showed her lying on the ground, the cubs curled around her, resting peaceful, no attack, no blood, just breath warmth contact. It made no sense. Every protocol said this wasn't possible, that the Zyn Cubs would tear apart any foreign being on sight, but here they were protecting her, nuzzling her like one of their own. One scientist whispered the words none of them wanted to say out loud. They've imprinted on her, like she's their mother. But even then, even in that impossible moment of peace, the danger was far from over, because the adult Zyn were watching to and to them. This was no miracle, it was a violation, an infection, a corruption of blood and instinct. They wouldn't let it continue, not for long, not with a human, not with her. And as Mara drifted into uneasy sleep, one of the cubs lifted its head, eyes glowing, staring straight into the night as if it knew something was coming, something terrible, and it would need to protect her with its life. She was not supposed to survive the first night, but she did, and not only did she survive, the Zyn Cubs surrounded her like she was one of their own, and the footage sent back by the second drone confused the human observers more than anything they had seen before, because nothing in the database explained this kind of behavior, not from Zyn Cubs, not from the most feared juvenile species in known space. The adults were dangerous, yes, but the cubs were unpredictable, unstable, violent in ways no scientist could fully understand. And now they were lying beside a human. Mara Lynn woke to the sound of soft breathing and strange warmth against her sides.
Ow.
She blinked in the pale morning light and saw them curled against her. All four of the cubs nestled close, one with its heavy head resting across her leg, another draped half over her shoulder. Their skin was cool and smooth like polished stone, but they radiated a soft heat, and in their sleep they made soft, low sounds, almost like purring. It was peaceful, impossibly peaceful. Mara's heart beat slowly, not in fear, but in awe. She barely moved, not wanting to break. The moment she reached for her wrist console and saw that her signal had reconnected partially, just enough to show life signs and send basic data back to orbit, she whispered into the console that she was alive, unharmed, and being watched over by the cubs, but she had no way of knowing if her message reached anyone. Meanwhile, up above on the orbital station, the senior observers were in a panic. The footage showed the cubs behaving like bonded younglings, like family, but the adults of the Zyn species were already reacting. Scouts had been seen near the crash site, keeping their distance for now, but everyone knew what would happen next, because this was something the Zyn elders would never allow. High Council of the Zyn did not forgive cross-species influence, and they did not tolerate changes to the sacred balance of their kind. For thousands of years, the cubs were raised in isolation, trained to hunt, kill, and survive anything that was not Zyn, and anything that tried to get close was destroyed before it could infect them with emotion or empathy. And now, a human had not only survived them, she had bonded with them, and that meant only one thing in the eyes of the Zyn elders: she had to be removed, and the cubs had to be corrected, or destroyed. Back on the surface, Mara stood slowly, the cubs stirring as she moved. The largest one, the one with the silver streak across its back, watched her carefully when she smiled and spoke to it gently, let out a soft chuffing sound, and rose to follow her. Then the others followed too. It was clear now she thought they weren't guarding her. Out of instinct, they were choosing to stay with her. She found the stream again, filled a broken piece of hull with water, and offered it to the smallest cub. It drank without hesitation, nudging her arm as if in thanks. She laughed softly, surprised By her own calm in this alien world with these creatures that by all logic should have killed her within second. Suddenly, a sound echoed through the forest, a sharp rhythmic pulse like low drums. The cubs froze their bodies, tense ears alert Mara, turned slowly and saw something move in the trees far in the distance, tall, dark figures shifting between the shadows. She saw glowing red eyes in the gloom that adult Zyn had come she. Backed away slowly, the cubs moved with her pressing close protectively. The largest one growled a low sound that made the air vibrate. Mara didn't know what it meant, but she felt the warning in it. Whatever was coming, they were not welcomed in. Without warning, the adults vanished as quickly as they had come, and a high-pitched tone rang in the sky. Mara looked up and saw a small drop beacon fall near. It was human-made. She rushed to it and activated the hologram. A face appeared, a young man with sharp eyes and a nervous smile. He introduced himself as Vale, a liaison for interspecies diplomacy, working under human command, and he had been watching the feeds. He said they needed to talk. That night, Mara sat near the wreckage, a small fire crackling quietly while the cubs lay in a circle around her. Vale's voice came through the tiny communicator. He said the situation was worse than anyone knew. The Zyn elders had declared her presence a violation and planned to retrieve the cubs for purification. A ritual that meant wiping their minds clean of her influence, or worse. Mara clenched her fists. She couldn't let that happen. She had seen how the cubs responded to her, not like pets, not like wild animals, but like people, like children, trying to understand something they had never been allowed to feel before. Safety, affection, trust. She wouldn't let that be destroyed. Vale offered a risky idea. He could send coordinates to a temporary shelter built by an older research team in the lower valleys away from the nesting ground if she could get there. The shelter had signal boosters enough to send a stronger message and maybe delay the Zyn's judgment long enough to find a peaceful solution. There was another problem. The adults were not the only danger now. The orbital command had also grown nervous seeing the footage of Mara surrounded by alien young. They feared contamination, or worse, a psychological manipulation technique. Some even believed the cubs were using her as a weapon, a human face, to fool human hearts. So the order had come down. If the situation couldn't be explained clearly within 48 hours, human command would authorize a clean sweep strike on the region to eliminate all unknown variables, including Mirashi sat in silence after hearing that. Watching the cubs sleep unaware of the ticking clock above them, she whispered to the communicator, "Tell them I will prove it. Tell them these cubs are not monsters. They are more than what the Zyn believe, and I will show them, but I need time." Vales. The voice was quiet as he replied, "Then you better move fast, Hat Dawn." Mara packed what little she could salvage from the wreckage and began the trek toward the coordinates sent by Vale. The cubs followed without hesitation. One of them carried a jagged piece of metal in its mouth like a toy. Another playfully jumped over a fallen log, brushing her side as it passed. They moved together like a single unit, instinctively watching for threats, shielding her without command or words, and that was what scared the Zyn elders the most. Not that the cubs were kind, not that they were playful, but that they were learning to care in ways no Zyn was meant to. As they reached the edge of the high ridge, Mara heard another drone above, this one different. Slower, louder, not human. The cubs hissed and ducked low. Mara followed their lead and watched as a Zyn scout craft swept over the trees. Scanning for movement, she stayed still, heart pounding, knowing that if they were seen, the elders would not wait any longer. The scout passed and she exhaled slowly. The cubs sniffed the air, then continued walking as if nothing had happened, and Mara realized something strange. She was no longer leading them. They were leading her. They trusted her, but they were watching for her, to learning from her each step, each choice, and it hit her hard. They were not just following her out of instinct, they were choosing her because they wanted to. But far above in the black halls of the Zyn Citadel, the elders watched the footage with growing fury. They saw the cubs sleeping beside a human. They saw them drinking from her hands. They saw them playing in the leaves like children, like fools, and they declared it a sickness, a weakness that must be removed. One elder stepped forward, his voice deep and final. He said, "The human has infected our future. The bond must be broken, and the cubs reclaimed by force." Meanwhile, Mara and the cubs reached the old shelter, a cracked steel dome half buried in vines and dust. She entered slowly, flashlight sweeping the walls. It was still intact. Barely she activated the console inside. It sent out a full emergency transmission with attached footage and data logs of her time with the Zyn Cubs. The message uploaded, she turned and saw all 4 cubs staring at her silently as if waiting for something. She knelt down, arms open, and without hesitation they stepped forward into her embrace. And in that moment she knew no matter what the Zyn decided, no matter what the humans feared, she had to protect them, even if it meant losing everything she knew, because they were not monsters. They were just children, and now they were hers. The sound of metal boots echoed through the forest before dawn, and everything felt colder than usual. The trees held their breath, and even the small insects that usually buzzed in the morning light were silent. The Zyn had arrived in full force. This time, not just scouts, but warriors armored and masked with blades attached to their arms and thick exoplating that covered their bodies. They moved in silence, and they moved with purpose. The decision had been made by the High Council that human would be taken, and the cubs would be reclaimed and corrected or destroyed. If necessary, inside the shelter, Mara stirred from a restless sleep. Her arms still wrapped around the cubs who had curled close to her in the night, their breaths slow and steady, their bodies warm and heavy. She didn't hear the approach at first, but she felt that something in the air shifted, like pressure building before a storm, and then the warning. Light on the console blinked red, motion detected, perimeter breached, unidentified signatures closing fast. Mara sat up, heart pounding. She grabbed her small utility pack and looked around the shelter for anything she could use to block the entrance. The cubs stood beside her, alert now, growling softly. They sensed the danger before she did. The largest one stepped in front of her, baring its teeth, a low sound vibrating in its chest. Mara placed a hand on its back, trying to calm it, whispering quietly that everything would be okay, but she didn't believe. And not really. The doors blew open without warning, a flash of energy, and a deep thud that shook the ground and filled the room with smoke. Through the haze stepped the Zyn warriors, silent and cold. They didn't attack. Not yet. They stood in formation. As if waiting for something, behind them walked a taller figure robed in silver and black, its face covered by a bone-white mask shaped like a skull. This was an elder, not just any elder, but one of the high voices of the Zyn race, a decision-maker, one whose word could mean life or death. The elder raised one hand and pointed at Mara, and then at the cubs. The warriors moved forward fast too. Fast to stop them. Mara shouted and tried to block them, but she was thrown aside gently, not to hurt her, but to remove her. The cubs roared and tried to fight back, teeth flashing, claws slashing, but they were outmatched, stunned by sonic bursts, then restrained in glowing cuffs that tightened around their limbs. The largest cub resisted the most and had to be forced to the ground, 3 warriors pinning it until it stopped moving. Mara screamed their names, or tried to. They didn't have names, not really, but she had called them things, soft words, like Silver and Fang and Shadow and Runt names. They responded to with joy, and now those names meant nothing to the warriors who dragged them away, as if they were just objects, broken tools, not living beings with thoughts and feelings. And Memorious Vale's voice came through the communicator. But it was too late, he said. He tried to stop the order. He said command was in chaos, arguing over jurisdiction and species law, but the Zyn elders had acted fast, and without hesitation, they had seized control of the situation. Mara was now a diplomatic complication, and the cubs were considered contaminated. She was taken to a holding cell deep beneath the Zyn outpost built into the cliffs, a room made of cold stone with no windows and no warmth, the place where nothing human belonged. She paced the room, her fists clenched, eyes burning with rage and helplessness. She didn't care about rules or protocols or laws anymore. She only cared about the cubs, where they were, what they were doing to them, whether they were afraid or in pain. Vale managed to visit her once, bringing food and water. He looked tired. His usual calm voice cracked when he spoke. He told her the cubs were alive, but separated, placed into isolation chambers meant to break any emotional connections they had developed, he said. The Zyn believed feelings made them weak, that care and love were threats to their survival and identity. Mara leaned forward, her voice low and fierce. She told him if they wipe their memories, if they erase what we built, I swear I will never forgive them, and I will never forgive you either if you let this happen. Vale nodded slowly and said he didn't want this either, that he had seen the footage and watched the bond grow, and he believed her. Now he believed the Cubs had chosen her not as a toy or a pet, but as something more, as family, and if the Zyn could not see that, then maybe they were the ones who needed to change. The next day, Mara was brought before the council chamber, a vast stone hall lit by glowing blue crystals. The elders sat on high seats looking down at her with unreadable expressions. The lead elder spoke in a deep voice, echoing through the room. He said the bond between human and cub was unnatural and dangerous, that the cubs must be returned to the old ways, and the human must be removed from their memory. Mara stood tall, her voice shaking but strong. She told them the cubs were not broken, they were awakening, they were discovering new parts of themselves and learning compassion and empathy, and that was not a weakness, it was evolution, it was growth. And if they destroyed that, they would not be protecting their future, they would be burying it. The elders were silent for a long time, then the lead elder spoke again and said the council would take her words into consideration, but until a final decision was made, she would remain in isolation, and the cubs would continue the purification process. Back in her cell, Mara collapsed onto the floor, tears burning in her eyes, not from fear, but from frustration, from the feeling of being powerless again. She had survived a crash, survived wild terrain, and bonded with creatures feared across the galaxy, and now everything was slipping away because of fear, because of tradition, because of a refusal to see the truth. Meanwhile, deep in the Zyn facility, the cubs were alone, each in a different chamber, each watched by silent machines that scanned their minds and delivered pulses of memory suppression. But something unexpected happened. The machines began to fail, not technically but emotionally. The cubs resisted, not with claws, but with willpower, with memories, flashes of her voice, her smile, the warmth of her hands. They did not forget. They could not forget. The largest cub silver slammed itself against the walls, howling in grief and fury. The smallest runt scratched symbols into the floor, simple shapes that resembled Mara's face. The one with the broken tooth refused to eat until a piece of cloth that smelled like her was returned. The machines reported anomalies, behavioral inconsistencies, signs of emotional bonding that refused to break. The elders grew worried. They increased the strength of the suppression, raised the levels, pushed harder, but the cubs fought back in their own way, silent but strong, holding on to the only connection that had ever made them feel safe. And then something happened that none of them expected. The youngest cub began to speak, not in full sentences, not in Zyn language, but in sounds Mara had taught. Its simple words like water and warm and home. The machines translated it, and for the first time in history, a Zyn cub spoke a human word on its own, without mimicry or programming. The elders were shaken. Their laws did not account for this. Their traditions had no answer to what was happening, because this was not contamination. It was transformation. And if they destroyed it, they might be destroying the only real hope their species had to evolve past fear. Back in her cell, Mara heard a new sound, a whisper. Through the wall, not from a speaker, but from something alive. She pressed her ear to the stone and listened closely. It was a hum, a soft rising tone. The same one the cubs had used to greet her on the first day. It was them. They were nearby. They were reaching out. She pressed her hand to the wall and hummed, beckoned. In the silence that followed, something shifted, something old and powerful and terrifying. She pressed her hand against the wall again and felt a vibration. Not just sound, but something deeper, like a heartbeat, slow and strong and familiar. It pulsed through the stone like a memory. The hum came again, soft and low, and full of emotion and Mara knew without doubt the cubs were alive, and they were close, and they were calling to her. Not with words, not with screams, but with the same sound they made. Oh. The day they first accepted her, the sound of trust, the sound of connection, the sound of something sacred. She dropped to the floor and whispered back, her voice shaky, her throat dry, but her tone clear. She made the same sound back, repeating it over and over, hoping they would hear her, hoping it would reach them through the walls, through the wires, through whatever machines tried to break them apart. She hummed and hummed until her voice gave out, and then she just breathed and let her heart beat. carry the message because she knew they were listening, and she knew they would answer on. Then they did. The smallest cub responded, first a short, echoing chirp like a reply, like a hello, like, "I'm still here, then." Another voice joined in deeper, this one from Silver, strong and defiant, and full of rage, not at her, but at what was being done to them. The others followed a chorus of low sounds that bounced off the metal walls and filled the air around her. And she cried not from sadness, but from relief, because they remembered, and they were fighting, and they were not giving up above. Her in the command tower, the Zyn elders watched the reports with growing unease. The machines were failing, not technically, but spiritually. The suppression was being resisted, and the mind scans showed strange anomalies, bright bursts of neural activity, patterns never seen before, emotions rising where there should have been numbness. One elder slammed his fist on the console, demanding that the levels be raised again. But another spoke up for the first time, questioning the process, asking whether it was truly purification or simply destruction of something they did not understand. The arguments spread through the council chamber, old voices clashing with younger ones, the tradition of control battling the new fear of change, and in the middle of it all was Mara, a human woman who had done the impossible and formed a bond with creatures that were never meant to feel such things. The decision was made to bring her to the observation chamber, not to set her free, but to study what effect her presence had on the cubs under direct watch. They took her from the cell in silence. Her arms bound her body, weak from days without proper sleep or food, but her eyes still full of fire. They led her through long corridors of black stone, past doors that hummed with energy and walls lined with glowing runes, until they reached the observation deck, a high chamber with glass windows that overlooked 4 separate rooms below and in each one was a cub. She gasped when she saw them. They looked thin and tired, and their fur was dull, but their eyes lit up the moment they saw her, and all of them rushed to the windows, pressing their claws and foreheads against the glass, making those same sounds again, the hum, the trill, the call of family. And Mara ran to the window, pressed her own hands to the barrier, and called back, tears running down her face. The Zyn elders watched from behind the glass, silent and unmoving, but their expressions unreadable. They expected the cubs to growl or strike the walls or fall back into silence. Instead, they gathered at the windows, making soft noises that no machine could translate, sounds of longing, sounds of comfort, sounds that broke every rule. The Zyn believed in about separation and strength, and the cold nature of survival. The lead elder turned to Vale, who had been allowed to observe, and demanded an explanation. Vale replied that this was no longer a matter of science or law. This was something older, something more powerful, something that no protocol could stop, he said. The cubs had chosen her not just as a companion, but as a guide, a protector maybe. Even something more, in that if the council destroyed that bond, they would not be preserving their species, they would be denying it a chance to evolve. Mara stood frozen, as one of the cubbies, the runt, placed its small clawed hand directly on the glass in front of her. And she placed her palm on the same spot, the glass between them lit with soft energy reacting to the shared biosignatures. The monitors beeped wildly, the data spiked, and one of the techs cried out, saying the emotional link had grown stronger. Despite everything, despite isolation and suppression, the connection had only deepened. The elders backed away from the monitors, unsure what to do. Some whispered that this was a sign of weakness, that the cubs had been tainted beyond saving, but others stood in silence, watching with eyes wide and uncertain, because in that moment something had changed, and they could feel it too deep inside, a crack forming in the walls of belief that had stood for generations. Suddenly, alarms blared, a power fluctuation shook. The tower lights flickered, and a loud hum rose through the floor, not from outside, not from an enemy, but from the cubbies themselves. They were humming louder now, altogether a perfect harmonic vibration that resonated through the building. And into the machines, the observation glass rippled under the force, not cracking but trembling, like it might if pressed too long under a deep ocean. Wave technicians scrambled to stabilize the systems. One screamed that the energy fields were collapsing, not from sabotage but from resonance. The emotional signal was interfering with the control. Mara looked around, heart racing, and realized the truth. The bond between her, the cubs, was more than emotional. It was biological. It was evolutionary. Something deeper than even she understood. She shouted to the elders, "Let them out. They need me, and I need them. This isn't just about them learning. It's about you understanding. They are not broken. They are becoming something more. And if you stop them, now you will never see what they could become." The lead elder stepped forward. Slowly, his voice low and full of weight, he asked her what she believed they were now, what she thought they had turned into under her influence, and she answered without hesitation. "They are your children, but they are also my family, and maybe four. The first time in your history, they are more than one thing, and that is not something to fear. It is something to protect." The elder stared at her for a long moment, then nodded once and gave a signal. The technicians hesitated, unsure if they had heard correctly, but then the locks disengaged, the doors slid open, and one by one, the cubs burst into the observation chamber, racing toward her with a speed that terrified the guards. But Mara did not move. She knelt and opened her arms, and all four of them crashed into her in a tangle of limbs and claws and soft growls. She laughed and cried and held them close, whispering their names over and over, and they made those same soft sounds, pressing against her, nuzzling into her as if trying to make sure she was real, that she was still theirs. And in that moment, the chamber was filled with something ancient and new. At the same time, the sound of belonging. One of the guards reached for his weapon, unsure if this reunion was safe, but the elder raised his hand and stopped him, watching carefully and saying nothing, because what he saw before him was not a threat, not a mistake, but a miracle land. So it was decided the cubs would not be erased. Their bond would be studied, not broken, and Mara would be allowed to stay with them under careful watch, but with full recognition that the bond was real and meaningful and sacred in a way no one had expected. As they rested together later in a quiet room built just for them, Mara looked up at the stars and whispered thank you to whatever force had led her to that crash, because in losing everything she had found something worth everything and more. The room was quiet now, not the cold, still silence of a prison, but the soft, warm silence of trust, of breath of life, moving slowly together in the same space. The cubs lay beside Mara, their bodies stretched out, their eyes half closed, their minds calm but alert, as if they were resting and guarding her at the same time, and she sat between them, not as a scientist, not as a subject, not as a human under observation, but as someone who belonged, someone who was needed, someone who was loved. She stroked the side of Silver's neck, gently feeling the rise and fall of his breath and the soft hum. And every time she touched him, it was like a purr, but deeper, something that echoed through her bones and made her feel anchored to something real and powerful. The runt snuggled into her lap, making small, sleepy noises, while Fang, the second largest, curled around her side like a living wall of warmth and shadow. The quietest sat at the edge of the room, his eyes always watching his body. Still but ready, as if waiting for danger. Mara knew this peace would not last. Not yet, because the bond they had formed was still a threat in the eyes of many. The Zyn elders had agreed not to erase the cubs, not to separate them again, but they had not accepted the bond fully. They still called it an anomaly, a mutation, something to be watched and studied like a disease that had not yet been cured and human. Command above was no better still, sending cautious messages, asking for updates, asking if Mara had been influenced, asking if the cubs could be turned into a weapon. Veil visited her the next morning, his face tired, his eyes full of conflict. He told her the council had seen enough proof to delay any final judgment, but the humans were growing impatient. They wanted answers, numbers, results, and none of them cared about the feelings of the cubs, only about whether they were stable and safe and loyal. And Mara told him that feelings were the only thing that mattered now, because without them the cubs would return to being what the Zyn made them, hunters' weapons, tools of fear. Veil sat beside her and watched the cubs, and after a long moment, he said quietly, "They are not what I expected. They are more, and that scares people." And Mara looked at him and said, "It scares me too, but not because I think they will hurt us, but because I think we will hurt them. And we won't even know we're doing it until it's too late later." That day, the cubs began to show signs of stress again. Small things at first: less sleep, more pacing, sudden flinches at strange sounds, and Mara knew it was because of the energy around them, the way the elders stared through the glass, the way the guards whispered the tension in the air like a storm. Waiting to break, the cubs could feel it. They always had. They were more sensitive than anyone thought. And now that they had tasted safety, they were terrified of losing it. Mara requested a private space outside the facility, a real open area, not a cell, not a chamber, something with sunlight and wind and sky. She argued that the cubs needed nature to heal, that the walls were pressing in on them, slowly crushing everything they had learned. The council hesitated, but after more days of data, showing rising anxiety levels and erratic behavior, they finally agreed to a small outdoor enclosure built near close, surrounded by shield fields and observation towers. When Mara led the cubs outside for the first time, they froze at the edge of the trees, blinking in the sunlight, their noses twitching at the scent of wild air, their bodies tense from too many days of metal and stone. Then the runt took the first step forward, a small hesitant move, followed by a curious sniff at a flower. Then a playful leap at a floating leaf, and the others followed slowly at first, then faster, running through the grass, chasing each other, growling and tumbling and laughing in the strange, soft way they had learned from her. Mara sat under a tree and watched, her heart aching with joy and fear. She knew this would not fix everything, but it was a start, a small piece of freedom, a taste of what life could be if the world let it grow. Vale joined her after a while and sat in silence until he said, "I have never seen them like this," and she nodded and said, "That's because they have never been allowed to be like this." Days passed slowly, the cubs growing stronger again, eating better, sleeping more, playing often, but always staying near her, always returning to her like a center of gravity. They listened when she spoke, they responded to her moods. They learned to mimic her tone, her gestures, even some of her words. And when she asked them to stop fighting once during a sudden outburst, they did not because they feared her, but because they trusted her, because they wanted to make her proud. Then one evening something unexpected happened. Shadow, the quietest of the four, sat beside her as the sun set and made a soft sound that almost sounded like a word. Mara turned, surprised, and listened closely. He tried again, shaping his mouth like hers, focusing his breath. And then finally he said it, soft and broken but clear. Mara, his voice low and rough like stone dragged across stone, but it was her name, and it was real. She gasped and touched his face gently and said, "Say it again," and he did. And then Silver tried, and Fang, and even the runt, each in their own way, said her name over and over, laughing in that strange alien way. And she cried again, not because she was sad, but because it meant something more. It meant they were choosing language, they were choosing her, they were choosing identity. But not everyone saw it that way. In the towers above, the scientists, both human and Zyn, debated whether this was natural or forced, whether Mara had programmed them without knowing whether this bond was ethical or dangerous or even sustainable. Some wanted to separate her again, test what would happen if she disappeared. Others wanted to take the cubs off-world, bring them to controlled labs, but Vale argued hard for her, for them, for the right to stay together. He told the council that what they were seeing was not just emotion, but evolution, that the bond had triggered something inside the cubs that could change the future of Zyn culture forever. And one elder said coldly, "Perhaps we do not want that future." And Vale answered quietly, "Perhaps you do not understand what future means." Then one morning disaster struck. The runt fell sick, his breathing shallow, his body shaking uncontrollably. Mara rushed to him, holding him close, calling for help, but the medtechs were slow. Afraid of getting too close, only Vale dared enter without hesitation, helping her place the cub on a diagnostic table. The readings showed a viral infection, something dormant inside him, triggered by genetic stress, possibly related to the energy pulses used during the separation days earlier. Doctors wanted to isolate him, run experiments, test chemical solutions, but Mara refused. She said he needed comfort, not just medicine. He needed her and the others. The bond itself might be the only thing strong enough to keep him stable, and she stayed by his side day and night, holding him, humming to him, feeding him drops of water, and the other cubs joined her, lying around him, pressing their bodies close, sharing warmth and breath and presence. After 2 days, his breathing slowed to normal, His fever broke and his eyes opened weak but clear. And the first thing he said was her name, and Mara laughed and cried at the same time, and hugged him tighter than ever before, and the monitors all lit up, showing healing rates far beyond natural levels, as if the emotional environment had boosted his immune response, as if love itself had become a cure. The doctors had no explanation, the council had no theory, the data made no sense, but the results were real and undeniable, and for the first time no one spoke against her. No one suggested removing her or moving the Cubs or breaking the bond again, because the truth was now too obvious to deny. As the sun rose on the 7th day since his illness, the 4 Cubs stood together beside her, strong and healthy and unafraid, their eyes bright, their bodies calm, and their hearts full of something no machine could measure. And when the wind blew through the trees and the sky turned gold, they all looked up together and hummed that same old sound, the one they had made on the first day, the one that meant we are family. The days grew longer and colder, not because the weather changed, but because the air around the facility thickened with tension, voices behind glass grew sharper, footsteps in the corridors quicker, the kind of speed that hides fear, the kind that says something is coming, something big, and Mara could feel it in her chest like a weight she could not name. She had seen this before in other stations and human research hubs. When the paperwork got quiet and the soldiers got loud, that was when decisions were made in silence and delivered in force veil, stopped visiting without warning, no word, no message, just gone, and the guards would not look her in the eye anymore, and the food for the Cubs arrived later than usual, delivered by drones. Not hands, and even the trees in the open space began to wilt from lack of care. Mara knew what this meant. Someone had decided something final. They were preparing for it without telling her. Without telling anyone who would stop them, she stayed close to the Cubs now, never leaving their side, even for sleep. They were restless again, pacing more, growling at shadows, and Fong even barked once when a technician passed by the glass, and the runt kept whining in his sleep, whispering her name over and over, his small body trembling, not from fear but from sensing hers. They always knew, they always felt it first, and now they were afraid, not of the elders, not of the other species, not of the strange new world, but of losing her then late. One night when the moons were low and the facility lights were dim, Mara heard the click of the outer door and the low hiss of atmosphere filters, and 2 humans entered, not soldiers, not scientists, but special ops, the kind who wore no badges, the kind who came when politics failed and control had to be reestablished. One of them looked at her through the glass and tapped his wrist, and she saw it, the recall code glowing red and final and irreversible. They were here to extract her forcibly, return her to the fleet orbiting above, wipe the memory logs, and leave the Cubs behind, or worse, transfer them to weapons labs. The places where no voice was heard again. She stood between the Cubs and the door, her hands raised, her voice steady even. As her heart raced, she told them to wait, to think, to see what she saw, but they did not answer. They only moved forward and activated the door. Override, the Cubs growled low, a united sound, deep and dangerous, and even Shadow stepped forward now, his eyes locked on the threat, and Mara reached for the comm panel, screaming for Vale, calling anyone who would listen, but there was only silence, and the door clicked open, and the taller human stepped in with a stunner drawn and pointed directly at the runt. That was when it happened. Something old, something buried deep inside the Cubs triggered, maybe instinct, maybe rage, maybe love. Silver lunged with a roar that shook the walls. Fang followed, and the runt leapt not at the human but at the panel, slamming it closed with his body, his small hands striking keys like he had seen Mara do, and alarms blared, lights flashed, and emergency locks sealed the room. The other human cursed and raised a weapon, but Shadow was faster, his body a blur, as he knocked it from the man's hand with a force that cracked bone, and Mara pulled the runt back, wrapping herself around him as she yelled for them to stop, not to kill, not to cross that line, and somehow they listened, their bodies heaving, their claws twitching, but they stopped, and they looked at her, waiting, breathing, choosing her voice over violence. Then the floor shook, a low rumble rising from deep below, and the lights Flickered red warning signs lit across every screen, and a voice, Mara did not recognize, said evacuation in progress. All personnel 2 life points in 2 minutes, and that was her only chance. She turned to the Cubs and whispered, "Run," and pointed to the vent near the med bay, the one she had mapped in secret during long nights. Of fear, they did not question her, not once. They moved like wind, silent, fast, focused, and she followed, crawling behind them through tight metal tunnels, past heat vents and coolant fans. Hearing the facility above fall into chaos and flames, they reached the outer fence in 4 minutes flat, just as the first explosion echoed behind them, and Mara saw the launch bay light up in orange, meaning the humans had failed and triggered the failsafe. The whole place would be scrubbed clean of data and life. They ran into the trees, into the dark and wild unknown of Zyranthra, the Cubs leading now, their senses guiding them, their bodies built for this, and Mara followed, never once slowing, never once falling behind, because this was not about escape anymore. It was about survival. It was about family and what you do when someone tries to break it. They ran until the smoke faded and the sky turned from red to black and the stars blinked above, like quiet watchers, and they stopped in a clearing beside an old fallen tree and collapsed together, breathing hard, hearts pounding, bodies bruised but alive and together. And that was when Vale appeared from the shadows, his face pale, his cloak torn, but his eyes clear, and he said, "I had to trigger the failsafe. I had no other way to stop them. I hoped you would find the vent." Mara did not speak. She only hugged him tight, and the Cubs surrounded them, as if to shield both from the past and the future, and they sat there in silence for a long time, letting the planet breathe around them, letting the fear bleed out. And when the sun rose again, the world looked different, not safer, not easier, but more theirs, and that was all they needed for now. The council chamber was colder than it had ever been, not because of the air or the stone, but because the eyes that filled it were no longer blind, no longer willing to follow silence where it led to harm. The walls that had once echoed with only command now pulsed with something more than law. Now the air itself held breath. It held waiting. It held judgment. And in the center of it all stood Mara, not as a prisoner, not as a guest, but as a voice for those who could not speak the old way, but who had spoken louder than anyone in the end. She did not bow when the elders entered, and neither did the Cubs, who now stood behind her, taller, stronger, different, their bodies leaner, their eyes brighter, their movements measured, and proud they were. No longer just younglings of a violent species, they were something new, something born of pain and kindness, of fear and trust, and the room felt it as they stepped in, not with growls, but with purpose. It's not as monsters, not as weapons, but as people. And that truth rippled like a storm through the hearts of every elder. Presentvale stood beside them, his robes torn, but his voice clear, and he read, "The charge is not against Mara, not against the Cubs, but against the doctrine, against the silence, against the fear that had ruled Zyranthra for so long." He read names of those taken in the name of order. He listed the programs hidden in shadows, and he laid bare the truth that the council had not protected their people they had imprisoned there. Future in cages of cold, and Lamara spoke only once, and when she did, the entire room leaned forward, not because she shouted, not because she accused, but because her voice trembled. With something greater than anger, she said, "I did not come here to break your laws. I crashed and I survived, and then your children found me and they showed me what your laws had forgotten. They showed me loyalty and empathy and courage. And if those things are dangerous, then maybe it is not me you should fear, but what you've forgotten." To Beatty, eldest of the elders, leaned forward, then his eyes sunken, but now clear as if sleep had finally come after a lifetime of noise, and he asked one question. He asked, "What are they now?" And he did not mean species, or subject, or weapon. He meant something more, and Mara looked back at the Cubs, and they looked at her, and the runt stepped forward, small still, but unshaking, and he spoke in broken Zyn, not perfect, but real, and he said, "We are what you could become." Chamber fell into silence after that. Not the silence of power, not the silence of threat, but the silence of change. The kind that happens not with fire but with stillness, the kind that ends eras and begins something not yet named, and no one moved. For a long time, and the stars above Zyranthra shone down through the crystal ceiling, and they did not look like they had before later. When the trial ended, and the records were updated, and the council reformed with new eyes and new hearts, Mara, and the cubs stood at the edge of the wild lands where the trees grew tall and the winds spoke in forgotten songs, and the cubs were no longer called cubs by the watchers, they were called kin the first. Kin of the new accord, and Mara was not called human or stranger or anomaly. She was called something they had no word for, so they used all of them. She was teacher, she was pack, she was flame and water and memory and hope. And when the humans above finally sent another signal and asked if extraction was possible, if the survivor was still alive, if the mission had failed, she answered with a simple message, one that would echo through time and spark 1,000 stories. She said, "I did not fail. I found something better, and I am not coming back." The wind moved through the trees, the kin lifted their heads to the stars, and somewhere far away a new song began the end.